Every civilization that has risen to prominence, from the Roman Empire to modern industrial powerhouses, understood one fundamental truth: power gravitates toward those who possess it within themselves first. The pages of history are filled with figures who recognized that external conquest means nothing without internal mastery. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this when he wrote about the prince's need for strength. Yet most contemporary interpretations of his philosophy miss the crucial prerequisite: the prince must first conquer himself before attempting to navigate the treacherous waters of external ambition. The modern world preaches a seductive doctrine of relational power. We are told that success stems from networking, from being liked, from collaboration and consensus. While these elements possess validity, they obscure a deeper truth that operates beneath the surface of human achievement. Before a person can effectively engage with the world, they must first establish dominion over the weakest kingdom they will ever encounter, themselves. This is not a metaphorical statement. The weak self is a tangible entity composed of undisciplined habits, unexamined fears, untrained instincts, and unchecked impulses. It is a kingdom constantly at war with itself, and no one benefits from this civil strife more than those who would see us diminished. Consider the trajectory of the ambitious person who has not yet destroyed their weak self. They possess talent, perhaps even intelligence. They may accumulate resources and climb social hierarchies. Yet their progress remains precarious, vulnerable to the smallest perturbation. A single critical comment can unravel their confidence. A minor setback becomes catastrophic. A rival needs only to understand their emotional triggers to render them ineffective. They are buildings constructed on unstable ground, impressive in appearance but fundamentally unsound. The Machiavellian perspective, properly understood, begins with an unflinching assessment of one's interior landscape. It requires the courage to examine not the person you believed yourself to be, but the person you actually are, in your moments of weakness, in your private thoughts, in your instinctive reactions when no one is watching. This examination is uncomfortable because it reveals contradictions we prefer to leave undisturbed. We discover that we claim to value discipline while routinely abandoning it. We assert our independence while remaining enslaved to the opinions of others. We declare our ambitions while allowing our weak self to negotiate compromises with inertia, fear, and mediocrity. The stakes of this internal transformation cannot be overstated. In the economic sphere, the person who has disciplined themselves internally makes decisions from a position of strength. They negotiate better terms because their weak self has been eliminated, the part that capitulates to pressure, that becomes emotional, that makes concessions out of fear or insecurity. In relationships, the internally strong person attracts quality people because they do not emanate neediness or desperation. They are not trying to convince others of their worth, they already know it. In leadership, the person who has conquered their weak self commands authority not through performed dominance but through genuine capability. Others sense this and orient themselves accordingly. The philosophy that emerges from this foundation is not one of cruelty or domination. Rather, it is a philosophy of strategic self-interest properly understood. When you have destroyed your weak self, you are no longer the victim of circumstance. You do not react to external stimuli with unconscious patterns. You do not sabotage yourself through self-doubt or hesitation. You move through the world with intentionality because you have already won the most consequential battle, the one fought within the boundaries of your own consciousness. Part 1: Understanding the weak self and its architecture. The weak self is not born fully formed. It develops gradually, often invisibly, through the accumulated choices of years. It begins in childhood when we first discover that comfort is preferable to challenge, that approval from others feels better than disapproval, that avoidance of pain is simpler than confrontation with it. These lessons are not inherently wrong, they are survival mechanisms that served us at a specific stage of development. The problem arises when we never graduate from these mechanisms. We carry them into adulthood like an athlete who never trains beyond the level of a child, wondering why we fail to excel. The weak self has several distinct components, each demanding separate attention for true transformation. The first component is physical indulgence without restraint. This manifests as the person who knows what they should eat but eats what tastes good. It appears as the individual who understands the necessity of exercise but postpones it perpetually. It shows itself in the person who stays up late despite knowing tomorrow will be compromised. These seem like small choices in the moment, almost inconsequential. Yet they accumulate. Each small capitulation of the will to the desire of the body weakens the neural pathways of self-control. Each compromise broadcasts to the subconscious mind a message of weakness. Over time, the self becomes accustomed to failure, and the capacity to succeed atrophies. The Machiavellian observer recognizes that physical discipline forms the foundation of all other discipline. A person who cannot control their consumption of food will struggle to control their consumption of distracting information. A person who cannot maintain an exercise regimen will lack the mental fortitude to persevere through difficult professional challenges. The body and mind are not separate entities engaged in internal negotiation, they are aspects of a unified system. When you discipline the body, you strengthen the mind. When you submit the body to comfort, you weaken the mind proportionally. This is not metaphysical philosophy but observable neurology. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and delayed gratification, strengthens through use and weakens through disuse, just as muscles do. The second component of the weak self is emotional reactivity. This is the machinery that transforms minor annoyances into major disturbances, that converts criticism into perceived attacks, that converts uncertainty into panic. The weak self is perpetually at the mercy of circumstances. When someone speaks harshly, the weak self feels injured. When a plan encounters an obstacle, the weak self experiences despair. When success proves elusive, the weak self generates narratives of hopelessness. This reactivity is the opposite of what Machiavelli identified in The Prince, the capacity to assess situations clearly and respond strategically rather than emotionally. The emotionally reactive person is extraordinarily vulnerable. Others quickly learn which words cause distress, which circumstances trigger defensiveness, which situations generate anxiety. Armed with this knowledge, they can manipulate the weak self with minimal effort. A competitor needs only to understand your insecurities to render you ineffective. A romantic partner can maintain control through the threat of withdrawal if your weak self desperately craves their approval. An employer can extract disproportionate effort by triggering guilt or fear. The weak self is a puppet, and those who understand its mechanics become puppeteers. Emotional control is not the suppression of emotion. This is a common misunderstanding that prevents many from progressing. Rather, it is the capacity to experience emotion while maintaining cognitive control over response. The emotionally developed person feels fear in dangerous situations but acts despite it. They experience disappointment when plans fail but immediately begin reconstructing. They feel anger at injustice but express it strategically rather than reactively. They have destroyed the part of themselves that conflates feeling something with being controlled by it. The third component is mental indiscipline. This appears as the constant seeking of distraction, the inability to direct attention without external structure, the mind that wanders perpetually toward thoughts of comfort or injury. In the modern world, this weakness has been amplified by technologies specifically engineered to exploit it. Every notification, every algorithmic suggestion, every infinite scroll is designed to pull the weak self away from disciplined thought and toward compulsive engagement. The person who has not destroyed their weak self is at the mercy of these tools. They believe themselves free while actually enslaved to patterns designed by engineers who understand psychology better than they understand themselves. The weak self cannot focus for extended periods on difficult problems. It cannot maintain complex thoughts without external reinforcement. It cannot read challenging material or engage in genuine learning because concentration requires discomfort, and the weak self has been trained to flee discomfort. This mental indiscipline manifests as perpetual surface-level knowledge, inability to develop expertise, and vulnerability to manipulation by those with deeper understanding. The weak self is intellectually weak even when native intelligence is high because intelligence without focus is merely potential never realized. The fourth component of the weak self is social dependence. This is the desperate need for approval, the fear of judgment, the constant internal commentary attempting to predict and manage others' perceptions. The weak self does not act according to internal principles, it acts according to external feedback. It modulates its personality for different audiences, not strategically as a necessity but desperately as a compulsion. It agrees with opinions it doesn't hold because disagreement feels dangerous. It refrains from speaking truth because the weak self has convinced itself that harmony is more important than integrity. This social weakness is particularly insidious because it disguises itself as kindness or cooperation. The person caught in social dependence genuinely believes they are being considerate when they are actually being manipulated by their own pathological need for acceptance. They cannot negotiate effectively because they fear being disliked. They cannot lead because they require consensus before acting. They cannot innovate because innovation requires the willingness to be wrong, to be criticized, to be unpopular during the period before ideas prove their worth. The weak self, in its social configuration, is desperate to be understood and believed by everyone. It expends enormous energy attempting to control how it is perceived. This is an unwinnable game. The Machiavellian thinker understands that you cannot control others' perceptions, you can only control your own actions. Some people will dislike you regardless of what you do. Others will appreciate you regardless of your mistakes. The weak self refuses to accept this reality and exhausts itself in futile attempts to achieve universal approval. The fifth component is the absence of long-term perspective. The weak self lives in the immediate. It cannot defer gratification for distant goals. It cannot maintain effort when results are not immediately visible. It cannot endure discomfort for years to achieve something meaningful. This is why people fail at training programs, why they abandon diets, why they leave careers before competence is established. The weak self cannot imagine a future self vividly enough to make sacrifices for them. It can only imagine the discomfort of the present moment. The consequences of allowing these components of the weak self to remain intact are far-reaching and devastating. The person with an undestroyed weak self is not merely less successful, they are radically vulnerable. Every aspect of their life is potentially weaponizable against them. Their fears can be exploited. Their desires can be manipulated. Their emotional reactivity can be triggered. Their social dependence can be leveraged. Their present focus can be used to prevent long-term strategic thinking. They are not whole people, they are collections of weaknesses held together by denial. Consider the professional implications. The weak self climbs the corporate ladder haltingly because it lacks the discipline to become exceptional at what it does. Excellence requires thousands of hours of focused attention, and the weak self cannot maintain this. It settles for competence and, then, wonders why others advance past it. When it does finally advance, it becomes defensive because its advancement was not based on genuine capability but on timing, connections, or others' mistakes. The weak self in a position of authority is frequently anxious, overcompensating with micromanagement or aggression. It cannot sleep well because it suspects others see through the facade. The romantic implications are equally stark. The weak self in a relationship is perpetually anxious about whether it is loved enough. It gives excessively to try to secure affection. It becomes resentful when this strategy fails because it does not understand that desperation is repellent. Others sense the weakness and either exploit it or lose interest. The weak self mistakes this pattern for romance being impossible when in fact romance becomes possible only after the weak self is destroyed. The financial implications should not be underestimated. The weak self cannot accumulate wealth because it cannot delay consumption. It lacks the discipline to follow through on plans. It makes decisions emotionally rather than strategically. It is susceptible to every scheme, every lifestyle inflation, every emotional purchase. It cannot negotiate effectively in transactions because negotiation requires the capacity to walk away, and the weak self is too desperate to do this. The weak self remains perpetually in precarious financial circumstances not because of external circumstances but because its internal architecture is incapable of sustained financial strength. This is the landscape of the weak self. It is not merely a collection of minor flaws. It is a comprehensive organizational structure of personal weakness that determines the trajectory of life. The person who allows their weak self to remain intact is not choosing a different path to the same destination. They are choosing a fundamentally different destination altogether, one characterized by vulnerability, precariousness, and the constant low-level fear of exposure and failure. The recognition of this architecture is the first necessary step toward destruction. Most people never examine their weak self clearly. They maintain comforting narratives about why they haven't achieved what they wanted. They blame circumstances, bad luck, others' jealousy, the world's unfairness. These narratives are lies, and they are lies the weak self uses to protect itself from the discomfort of change. The Machiavellian approach begins not with motivation or inspiration but with unflinching honesty. You must see yourself clearly before you can transform yourself. Part 2, The Path of Self-Destruction and Reconstruction. The destruction of the weak self is not a single event but a sustained campaign. It requires strategy, commitment, and the willingness to be deeply uncomfortable for an extended period. It is not a self-help program with a guaranteed outcome in 30 days. It is a fundamental rewiring of the self, and rewiring requires time proportional to how deeply the weak patterns have been embedded. The first phase of this campaign is the establishment of what might be called strategic constraints. These are external structures that make weakness more difficult and strength more automatic. The weak self thrives in freedom. It interprets freedom as the absence of constraints and, therefore, as permission to follow impulses. Strategic constraints replace this with systems where right action is the path of least resistance. Physical discipline serves as the ideal starting point because results are rapid and the mechanics are straightforward. The person beginning this campaign might establish that they will exercise for 1 hour, 5 days per week, without exception. This is not negotiable. Weather, mood, fatigue, these become irrelevant. The action is scheduled like a professional obligation because it is one. The body will resist initially. The weak self will generate narratives about why today is different, why this exception is justified. These narratives are lies, and they must be recognized as such. The commitment is kept regardless. This seems like a small thing, yet the psychological ramifications are enormous. Each day that the commitment is kept, the subconscious receives clear information: you are someone who does what you say you will do. Each broken commitment would send the opposite message. Over weeks and months, as commitments accumulate, the self-concept begins to shift. You are no longer a person who tries to exercise, you are a person who exercises. This is not motivational thinking, this is fundamental identity restructuring. The second phase involves the systematic dismantling of comfort-seeking behaviors. This is where the destruction becomes genuinely intense. The weak self has built elaborate systems of comfort, ways of eating, ways of spending time, ways of thinking that provide constant low-level pleasure and distraction. These must be identified and systematically removed. If you have spent years of every evening consuming entertainment, streaming television, scrolling social media, this behavior pattern must be dismantled. The evening hours must be reclaimed as space for genuine activities: learning, creating, planning, exercising. This is extraordinarily uncomfortable initially. The weak self experiences something approaching withdrawal. The urge to revert to the comfort-seeking behavior is intense. This is precisely the point. The discomfort is the tool of transformation. Each time you resist the urge to engage in the comfortable behavior, you are weakening the weak self and strengthening the disciplined self. The same applies to eating patterns. If your diet has been built around immediate pleasure rather than long-term health, this must change completely. Not somewhat. Not with flexibility. Completely. This does not mean deprivation, it means substitution. Good food that serves your health replaces poor food that serves your pleasure in the moment. The weak self will rebel against this. Food serves emotional functions for most people: comfort, reward, stress relief. When these functions are removed, the weak self must learn to handle emotions directly rather than through food. This is painful, and it is precisely the point. The elimination of media consumption is often the most consequential phase of this transformation. Modern technology has engineered content to be addictive because addiction is profitable. The weak self, once released into this environment, cannot escape without external support. The solution is radical: eliminate it. Not reduce it. Not manage it better. Eliminate it. This includes social media, algorithmic content platforms, most news, most entertainment. This seems extreme, and it is. The goal is extreme, the destruction of the weak self, not its minor improvement. In the space created by removing these behaviors, genuine activities become possible. The person who used to spend 5 hours daily consuming content suddenly has 5 hours available. These hours are the raw material of transformation. They become hours for deep learning, skill development, physical cultivation, strategic thinking, relationship building. The transformation occurs not because you are forcing yourself to be better but because you have simply removed the obstacles preventing you from becoming better. The third phase is the systematic development of emotional discipline. This is more subtle than physical discipline because emotion cannot be simply eliminated, it can only be understood and integrated. The goal is not to become emotionless but to become emotionally intelligent, which means experiencing emotion while maintaining cognitive control. This phase requires honest examination of emotional triggers. What situations generate strong negative emotion? What interactions leave you feeling depleted or defensive? What circumstances make you second-guess yourself? Each trigger is a location of weakness that must be systematically addressed. For many people, criticism triggers defensiveness. The weak self interprets criticism as attack and responds with either submission, agreement, or aggression, counterattack. Neither is optimal. The emotionally disciplined response is to receive the information, evaluate its validity, and respond strategically. This requires deliberate practice. When you are criticized, the initial emotional reaction will be strong. The practice is to pause before responding. Wait for the initial emotional surge to pass. Then, evaluate the criticism logically. Is it valid? Is there something in it worth considering? Respond with this evaluation, not with emotion. Over time, this becomes automatic. Criticism becomes information rather than threat. The weak self's trigger is systematized and neutralized. The same applies to rejection, failure, and disappointment. Each of these generates emotional responses in the weak self. With practice, these responses are transformed into information that informs strategy. The rejection is not personal injury, it is data. The failure is not evidence of inadequacy, it is a learning opportunity. The disappointment is not cause for despair, it is indication that plans require adjustment. The emotionally disciplined person moves through life experiencing these events differently from the weak self not because they feel less but because they interpret more accurately. The fourth phase is the systematic dismantling of social dependence. This is the phase where destruction becomes visible to others, and social consequences become real. This is the test of whether the commitment to destruction is genuine or merely lip service. The first step is the establishment of authentic self-expression. The weak self modulates its behavior constantly, presenting different versions of itself to different audiences. This is exhausting and creates profound disconnection from one's own values. The disciplined self has core values that do not change based on audience. This does not mean being deliberately provocative or antagonistic. It means your actual beliefs, opinions, and personality are visible rather than hidden. This requires the willingness to be wrong in public. To express an opinion that might be disliked. To refuse to agree with consensus when you genuinely disagree. To take positions that might cost you social approval. This is terrifying to the weak self because social approval has been its primary source of security. The transition from social dependence to social independence is genuinely painful. People who liked you when you were desperately seeking their approval may dislike you when you stop seeking it. This is a reliable indicator that they were responding to your weakness rather than to you. As you become stronger, your social circle will contract. This is not loss, it is correction. The disciplined person does not need universal approval. They have internal standards and they align their behavior to these standards regardless of external feedback. This sounds harsh, and perhaps it is. Yet it is the only path to genuine respect, which is far more valuable than approval. People respect strength. They may not like strong people, but they respect them. They are drawn to strong people. They trust strong people. And, crucially, they cannot manipulate strong people. The elimination of social dependence is typically accompanied by a simultaneous increase in influence. This seems paradoxical, yet it is entirely logical. When people sense that you do not desperately need their approval, they grant it more freely. When you are comfortable with disagreement, others take your agreement more seriously. When you are willing to walk away from situations, others try harder to keep you. The weak self reversed all of these dynamics. The fifth phase is the cultivation of long-term perspective. This is the capacity to imagine a future self vividly and make decisions that benefit that self even at the expense of the present self. This directly counters the weak self's present focus. This phase begins with written articulation of long-term goals. Not vague aspirations but specific, detailed descriptions of who you want to become and what you want to have accomplished. These written descriptions become an external representation of the future self. They serve as a reference point when present desires conflict with future goals. When the weak self wants to engage in a behavior that undermines the future goal, you are no longer merely resisting impulse, you are actively choosing the future self over the present self. This makes the choice meaningful rather than merely difficult. The long-term perspective transforms decision-making entirely. The person with a clear future vision does not make choices based on immediate comfort. They ask instead, does this move me toward or away from my goals? Does this develop skills I want to develop? Does this align with who I want to become? This framework makes countless decisions automatic. The ambiguous choice resolves itself when evaluated against long-term goals. This phase requires patience because the results are not immediately visible. You must engage in difficult actions for months or years before seeing significant progress. The weak self craves immediate feedback, immediate proof of progress. The disciplined self understands that many of the most important transformations happen invisibly. Skills develop in increments too small to be visible day to day but enormous when viewed year to year. Character develops through repeated choice, and no single choice is transformative. But 1,000 choices in alignment with values absolutely is transformative. The complete destruction of the weak self is a years-long process. There is no endpoint after which you are done and can relax. Rather, there is a transition point where the disciplined self becomes your default mode and the weak self becomes the exception rather than the rule. At this point, the person has crossed into a fundamentally different mode of operation. They think differently, respond differently, and, therefore, experience life differently. Part 3, Strategic Superiority and the Invincible Self. When the weak self has been substantially destroyed, the person discovers that their circumstances have not fundamentally changed. They still face the same economic realities, the same family situations, the same obstacles. Yet everything feels different because they have fundamentally changed. This is not the difference between having money and not having money. It is the difference between being capable and incapable of handling whatever circumstances arise. The first advantage of the destroyed weak self is resilience to external pressure. The weak self is perpetually under stress because it is perpetually vulnerable. Every interaction is a potential threat, every circumstance a potential disaster. The person with a destroyed weak self operates from a position of fundamental security because they have already survived their most dangerous enemy, themselves. External threats, by comparison, are manageable challenges. This resilience is immediately visible to others, even if they cannot articulate it. When you walk into a negotiation, others sense whether you are desperate or secure. The weak self cannot hide its desperation, it emanates from the nervous system. The disciplined self projects security because it is secure. This changes everything about how others approach you. They offer better terms. They treat you with more respect. They are more honest because they sense that lying will be unsuccessful. The second advantage is strategic decision-making. The weak self makes decisions based on emotion, fear, and impulse. The disciplined self makes decisions based on analysis, principles, and alignment with long-term goals. This is the difference between being reactive and being active. The reactive person is constantly adjusting to circumstances. The active person is directing circumstances. The difference in outcomes is profound. A person who has destroyed their weak self does not suddenly gain access to special knowledge. They do not become able to predict the future. They become able to respond to predictable human patterns. They understand that most people are operating from their weak selves and, therefore, behave predictably. The person desperate for approval will make poor decisions to gain it. The person afraid of criticism will avoid intelligent risks. The person enslaved by comfort will lack discipline. The person emotionally reactive will be manipulable through emotional triggers. These patterns are as reliable as physics. The strategic thinker, freed from their own weak self, can navigate around these predictable patterns in others. They can negotiate effectively because they do not need the other person's approval. They can lead effectively because they have overcome the same patterns they expect others to struggle with. They can innovate effectively because they are not imprisoned by the demand for consensus. They can build wealth effectively because they are not enslaved by the consumption impulse. The third advantage is the capacity for genuine connection. This seems counterintuitive given the emphasis on self-reliance and independence. Yet the opposite is true. The weak self cannot genuinely connect because it is too concerned with how it is perceived. It cannot listen deeply because it is constantly monitoring the other person's reaction to it. It cannot be vulnerable because vulnerability threatens its precarious facade. It cannot offer genuine value because it is too focused on extracting value. The person with a destroyed weak self can genuinely listen because they have nothing to defend. They can be vulnerable because their worth is not threatened by others' judgments. They can offer genuine value because they are not keeping score. Paradoxically, this makes them far more valuable to others. People are drawn to people who are secure, who listen, who give without keeping score. The weak self attempts to gain connection through neediness and approval seeking, which repels people. The disciplined self gains connection through security and genuine interest, which attracts people. The fourth advantage is the capacity for exceptional skill development. Excellence requires thousands of hours of focused practice. The weak self cannot sustain this because it requires enduring discomfort for extended periods without immediate reward. The disciplined self not only can sustain this, but does so habitually. Every skill, every expertise, every meaningful accomplishment is built on this foundation. The person with a destroyed weak self does not need to be motivated to practice. Motivation is temporary and fickle. They have structured their life such that practice is simply what they do. They write every day because writing is scheduled like exercise. They read challenging material because reading is part of their evening structure. They practice their craft because practice is the default action. Over years, this produces expertise that seems to come from natural talent but actually comes from this unsexy structure of repetition. The fifth advantage is clarity of vision. The weak self is confused because it is pulled in multiple directions by competing impulses and desires. The disciplined self, having eliminated the noise of undisciplined desires, can see clearly what actually matters. This clarity extends to every domain of life. Career decisions become clear because you evaluate them against your actual values rather than against what others think is prestigious. Relationship decisions become clear because you choose based on actual compatibility rather than based on fear of being alone. Financial decisions become clear because you are building towards something specific rather than trying to satisfy the moment. The person who has destroyed their weak self is not invulnerable to failure. They still encounter circumstances that defeat their plans. They still experience loss and disappointment. The difference is that failure does not damage their sense of self because their sense of self is not dependent on success. They have already proven to themselves that they are capable of discipline, commitment, and overcoming difficulty. This becomes their stable identity, and individual failures are events that happen to them rather than definitions of them. This is where the Machiavellian insight becomes most powerful. The prince who must conquer external enemies while remaining vulnerable to his own internal enemies is always at risk. The prince who has already conquered himself is nearly unconquerable. Not because he has special powers, but because he cannot be defeated except through genuine superior force applied directly. He cannot be manipulated through fear because he is not afraid of social disapproval. He cannot be deceived through flattery because he has no desperate need to believe it. He cannot be corrupted through the offer of comfort because he has already demonstrated that comfort is not his master. The strategic superiority that emerges from this foundation extends to every domain of life. In business, the person with a destroyed weak self will outcompete others not necessarily through greater intelligence but through greater persistence, clearer vision, and better decision-making. They will build teams more effectively because they can recognize talent without needing to be liked by the talented. They will negotiate more effectively because they are willing to walk away from bad deals. They will innovate more effectively because they are willing to fail publicly. In relationships, the person with a destroyed weak self will attract higher quality partners because they emanate security rather than neediness. They will maintain better relationships because they can listen and be vulnerable without fear. They will be more effective parents because they can lead without being desperate for their children's approval. They will have deeper friendships because they can offer genuine connection rather than transactional approval seeking. In financial domains, the person with a destroyed weak self will accumulate wealth more effectively because they are not enslaved by consumption impulse. They will make better investments because decisions are strategic rather than emotional. They will take more intelligent risks because risk is evaluated rationally rather than feared emotionally. They will build more stable financial lives not through luck but through systematic discipline. The ultimate realization that comes from destroying the weak self is that external circumstances are far less determinative than most people believe. The person born poor who destroys their weak self will not necessarily become rich, but they will have far more control over their circumstances than the rich person who is not. The person born without connections who destroys their weak self will build more valuable relationships than the well-connected person who is not. The person born without native genius who destroys their weak self will accomplish more than the genius who is not. This is because the weak self is the primary obstacle to achievement in most domains. Circumstances matter, certainly. Timing and luck matter. But the weak self matters more. The person constantly in negotiation with themselves, constantly failing to follow through on commitments, constantly making decisions they regret, constantly seeking approval and reassurance, this person will waste their entire life regardless of circumstances. The person who has destroyed their weak self will make progress regardless of circumstances because every resource they possess will be directed coherently toward their goals. The maintenance of this transformation requires eternal vigilance. The weak self does not die, it merely becomes dormant. The person who has destroyed their weak self cannot become complacent. They must continue the disciplines that created the transformation or risk regression. This is not a burden but a necessity, like continuing to eat and breathe. The person who has experienced the benefits of the disciplined self would not willingly return to the weak self even if they could. The final and most profound advantage of destroying the weak self is freedom. This seems paradoxical given the emphasis on discipline and constraint, yet it is the deepest truth. The weak self is a prisoner of impulse, fear, and others' judgments. It believes it is free when it is simply enslaved to different masters. The disciplined self is truly free because it has chosen its masters and maintains their authority voluntarily. It acts according to its own values and principles rather than according to the demands of impulse or the judgments of others. This freedom extends to the future. The person with a destroyed weak self is not locked into previous patterns. They can change direction if circumstances warrant because change does not threaten their identity. They have proven they can do difficult things, so new challenges are simply variations on a familiar theme. They are not trapped by others' expectations because they do not need others' approval. They are not locked into specific roles because their worth is not dependent on external validation. They are genuinely free in ways that few people experience. The Machiavellian path to success, properly understood, begins with this recognition: before you can move mountains, you must move yourself. Before you can conquer others, you must conquer yourself. Before you can be invincible in the world, you must be invincible within yourself. The man who has destroyed his weak self has already won the most important victory of his life. Everything that follows is implementation of a strategy grounded in a foundation of genuine strength.